Hello, and welcome to a journey through time that will change the way you think about survival, adaptation, and what it truly means to be human. Tonight, we're going to step back through millions of years to explore a question that sits quietly at the heart of our existence. How did our ancestors not just survive, but thrive during the Stone Age, when the world was a place so harsh and unforgiving that it would challenge everything we think we know about human resilience? Picture this for a moment. You wake up tomorrow morning, but instead of reaching for your phone, instead of turning on the lights or checking the weather app, you step outside into a world where the nearest neighbour might be days away on foot, where the temperature can drop to bone-chilling levels without warning, where your next meal isn't guaranteed and every shadow could hide a predator that sees you not as the apex species you've come to believe you are, but as just another potential source of food. This was reality for our ancestors for over 99% of human history. Not for a few difficult years, not during temporary hardships, but for millions of years. And yet, here we are, which means they didn't just survive, they mastered survival in ways that might actually shock you. Before we begin this exploration together, I'm curious, where are you right now as you listen to this? Are you somewhere warm and safe? Perhaps winding down after a long day, or maybe you're starting your morning, coffee in hand, ready to learn something that might shift your perspective on what humans are truly capable of. Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, you're about to discover that the story of Stone Age survival isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for understanding resilience, innovation, and the remarkable adaptability that still flows through your veins today. If you find yourself drawn to these kinds of deep explorations into human history and the I'd be grateful forces that shaped us, if you'd consider subscribing. It helps this content reach others who might be searching for something thoughtful to accompany their evening routine or morning reflection. But for now, let's step together into a world that was simultaneously more dangerous and more wondrous than anything we experience today. Chapter 1: The Invisible Revolution that Changed Everything. The Stone Age began roughly 3.3 million years ago, and when we say it lasted until about 3000 BC, we're talking about a span of time so vast that it's almost impossible to truly comprehend. To put this in perspective, all of recorded human history, everything from the first written words to the smartphone in your pocket, represents less than 1% of the time humans spent living in what we call the Stone Age. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where most people's assumptions about our ancestors start to crumble. These weren't primitive beings barely clinging to existence. They were innovators, engineers, and problem solvers whose ingenuity would put many modern survival experts to shame. They didn't just stumble through millions of years of evolution. They actively shaped their world with tools, strategies, and social structures that were far more sophisticated than we've traditionally given them credit for. The first breakthrough that changed everything happened around 2.6 million years ago, and it might seem almost mundane to our modern eyes. Someone picked up a rock and intentionally struck it against another rock to create a sharp edge. That moment, that first deliberate modification of a natural object to serve a specific purpose, represents perhaps the most significant leap in human development until the invention of writing. These weren't random acts of violence against stone. Archaeological evidence from sites like Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania reveals that our ancestors were following specific techniques, passing down knowledge about which rocks worked best, how to strike them at precisely the right angle, and how to create tools that were sharp enough to cut through animal hide, but durable enough to last for extended periods. Imagine the cognitive leap required for this innovation. It meant understanding cause and effect, being able to visualize a desired outcome, and having the patience to practice until the technique was mastered. It meant recognizing that a rock was not just a rock, but raw material that could be transformed into something entirely different and infinitely more useful. The Oldowan tools, as archaeologists call them, were deceptively simple. River pebbles struck with spherical hammerstones to create sharp flakes and cutting edges. But within that simplicity lay a revolution. Suddenly our ancestors could process food more efficiently, create other tools from wood and bone, and begin the long journey toward reshaping their environment rather than simply adapting to it. As time progressed, these tools became more sophisticated. The development of the Acheulean hand axe around 1.8 million years ago represents another quantum leap. These weren't just sharp rocks anymore. They were carefully crafted implements with symmetrical designs, smooth surfaces, and cutting edges that extended around the entire perimeter. Creating one required advanced planning, precise motor control, and an understanding of three-dimensional geometry that we're only now beginning to fully appreciate. But tools were just the beginning, because once our ancestors could reliably create sharp edges, they unlocked possibilities that would transform not just how they lived, but how they thought, how they organized themselves, and ultimately, how they conquered environments that should have been impossible for a relatively small, slow, and physically vulnerable primate to survive. Chapter 2: The Mastery of the Hunt. If you've ever watched a nature documentary about early humans, you might have the impression that our ancestors spent their time cowering in caves, occasionally venturing out to scavenge whatever scraps the real predators left behind. This image couldn't be further from the truth. Archaeological evidence reveals that Stone Age humans were not just hunters, they were apex predators who developed hunting strategies so effective that they may have contributed to the extinction of numerous megafauna species. The evolution of hunting technology tells a story of relentless innovation driven by necessity. It began with simple wooden spears, sharpened to points and hardened in fire. These early weapons required hunters to get dangerously close to their prey, turning every hunt into a test of courage, skill, and teamwork. But even these basic tools represented a profound shift in the relationship between humans and the natural world. Consider the psychological transformation required to face down a woolly mammoth or a cave bear with nothing but a pointed stick and the support of your hunting party. This wasn't desperation. This was calculated risk-taking based on accumulated knowledge, careful planning, and absolute trust in your fellow hunters. Every successful hunt reinforced not just the physical skills needed for survival, but the social bonds that made such dangerous cooperation possible. The real revolution came with the development of composite tools, weapons made from multiple materials bound together with plant fibers or animal sinews. A wooden shaft tipped with a carefully crafted stone point could penetrate deeper while remaining light enough to throw accurately over considerable distances. This innovation didn't just make hunting more effective, it made it safer. Hunters could strike from farther away, reducing their exposure to the deadly counterattacks of wounded animals. By about 300,000 years ago, sites like Schöningen in Germany reveal evidence of hunting spears so well crafted that they would be recognizable to any modern hunter. These weren't crude, desperate weapons. They were precision instruments designed by people who understood aerodynamics, leverage, and the specific anatomical vulnerabilities of their prey. The development of the bow and arrow, appearing in the archaeological record around 50,000 years ago, represents perhaps the most sophisticated hunting technology of the Stone Age. Creating a functional bow requires understanding tension, compression, and the elastic properties of different woods. Arrows demand precise balance, aerodynamic design, and points sharp enough to penetrate, but not so heavy that they throw off the trajectory. The entire system requires coordination between eye, hand, and mind that rivals any modern athletic skill. But the most remarkable aspect of Stone Age hunting wasn't the weapons themselves, it was the knowledge systems that supported them. Successful hunters had to understand animal behavior in ways that would impress modern wildlife biologists. They needed to know migration patterns, seasonal changes in animal condition, mating behaviours that might make prey more or less dangerous, and the subtle environmental cues that indicated where different species might be found. This knowledge wasn't written down. It was embedded in stories, songs, and rituals that ensured crucial survival information was passed from generation to generation without loss. The elaborate cave paintings found at sites like Lascaux and Chauvet weren't just art for art's sake. They were detailed records of animal anatomy, behaviour, and seasonal variations so precise that modern wildlife experts can determine the time of year a painting was created just by looking at the condition of the animals depicted. The social organisation required for successful hunting was equally sophisticated. Archaeological evidence suggests that Stone Age hunting parties operated with levels of coordination and communication that required advanced planning, clear role assignments, and the ability to adapt strategies in real time based on changing circumstances. These weren't random groups of individuals, they were highly trained teams whose survival depended on each member understanding not just their own role, but how that role fit into the larger strategy. The tools and techniques of Stone Age hunting reveal something profound about human nature that we sometimes forget in our modern, climate-controlled world. When survival was truly on the line, our ancestors didn't just adapt, they innovated. They didn't just react to their environment, they began the long process of reshaping it to serve their needs. And they didn't do it alone. They developed forms of cooperation and knowledge sharing that laid the foundation for every human achievement that would follow. Chapter 3: The Architecture of Survival. When we think about Stone Age shelter, most of us probably imagine crude caves or perhaps simple lean-tos made from whatever materials happen to be lying around. But archaeological discoveries over the past few decades have revealed something far more sophisticated: evidence of architectural planning, innovative construction techniques, and domestic spaces organised with a level of thoughtfulness that challenges our assumptions about prehistoric intelligence. Take, for example, the extraordinary discovery at Terra Amata in southern France, where archaeologists uncovered evidence of structures built around 400,000 years ago. These weren't random arrangements of sticks and stones. They were carefully planned dwellings with foundations made from rings of stones, flat threshold stones serving as doorways, and vertical posts down the centre that supported roofs made from interwoven branches and twigs, likely covered with layers of straw or hides. What makes this discovery remarkable isn't just the sophistication of the construction, but what it reveals about the cognitive abilities of the builders. Creating a structure like this requires understanding load distribution, weather resistance, and the properties of different materials. It requires planning ahead, gathering specific materials, and coordinating the efforts of multiple people. In other words, it requires thinking like an architect. But perhaps the most extraordinary example of Stone Age architectural innovation comes from Siberia, where Russian archaeologists discovered structures built entirely from mammoth bones. Imagine the planning required for such a project. First, the builders had to locate mammoth carcasses or hunt these massive animals. Then they had to transport bones weighing hundreds of pounds across potentially vast distances. Finally, they had to understand how to fit these irregular, massive pieces together into a stable structure that could withstand the brutal Siberian winter. The result was remarkable: dome-shaped dwellings where great tusks formed the primary support structure, skulls and leg bones created the walls, and the entire framework was covered with hides and sod. These weren't temporary shelters, they were permanent winter residences that could house multiple families and featured carefully constructed hearths designed to maximize heat while minimizing smoke buildup. These mammoth bone houses reveal something profound about Stone Age society. Building one required not just individual skill, but community cooperation on a scale that suggests complex social organization. Someone had to coordinate the hunting or gathering of materials. Someone had to design the structure. Someone had to organize the labor needed for construction. And someone had to ensure that the finished dwelling met the needs of all the families who would shelter there during the long, dark months of winter. The sophistication extends to the smallest details. Archaeological excavations at sites like Ohalo II in Israel, dating to about 23,000 years ago, have revealed evidence of carefully constructed bedding made from selected grass species, arranged in specific patterns around central hearths, and secured with what appears to be an adhesive clay substance. The floor plans of these structures show distinct areas for different activities: tool making, food preparation, sleeping, organized with a logic that mirrors modern domestic spaces. This level of organization suggests that Stone Age humans weren't just focused on immediate survival. They were investing time and energy in comfort, in creating spaces that serve not just physical needs, but psychological ones as well. The careful arrangement of bedding, the designation of specific areas for different activities, the construction of hearths that provided not just heat but light and a focal point for social gathering. All of this points to people who understood that survival wasn't just about staying alive, but about maintaining the social bonds and mental well-being that made life worth living. The seasonal adaptation of Stone Age architecture is equally impressive. During brief summer months, hunters would move out onto the open plains, constructing dome-shaped huts partially dug into the earth for insulation. These temporary structures used latte works of available bones or wood, topped with sod or hides, and could be occupied for months at a time as groups followed animal migrations or took advantage of seasonal resource abundance. What emerges from the archaeological record is a picture of people who were master engineers working within severe material constraints. Without metal tools, without draft animals, without any of the technologies we consider essential for construction, they created structures that were weatherproof, comfortable, and designed to last. They understood thermal dynamics, structural engineering, and the importance of proper ventilation. They knew how to work with the materials their environment provided, how to maximize efficiency, and how to create spaces that served multiple functions. But perhaps most importantly, these Stone Age architects understood something that we sometimes forget in our modern world: that shelter is more than just protection from the elements. It's the foundation of community, the space where knowledge is shared, where social bonds are strengthened, and where the next generation learns the skills they'll need to survive and thrive. The careful attention our ancestors paid to creating these spaces reveals a deep understanding of human nature and the conditions necessary for not just survival, but for the flourishing of human culture and innovation. As we move forward in our exploration of Stone Age survival, we'll discover that this architectural sophistication was just one part of a much larger system of innovation that would ultimately make it possible for humans to colonize every continent on Earth, to survive ice ages and climate changes that drove countless other species to extinction, and to develop the social and technological foundations that would eventually lead to the complex civilization we inhabit today. But first, we need to understand perhaps the most crucial innovation of all, the one that made everything else possible, and that represents what many scientists consider the single most important development in human evolution. Chapter 4: The Flame That Changed Everything. The discovery of fire control represents what many scientists consider the single most transformative moment in human evolution. Not the invention of fire, nature had been creating flames through lightning strikes and volcanic activity for millions of years before humans existed. What changed everything was the moment our ancestors learned to capture, maintain, and direct this elemental force for their own purposes. Archaeological evidence suggests this mastery began as early as 1.5 million years ago, though it didn't become widespread until much later. But whenever it happened, that first moment when a human being looked at a natural fire and thought, "I can keep this alive," represents a cognitive leap so profound that it fundamentally altered the trajectory of our species. Think about what fire control actually meant. It required understanding that fire was a living thing that needed to be fed, that different materials burned in different ways, that flames could be encouraged or suppressed through careful manipulation of fuel and airflow. It meant developing the patience to tend a fire constantly, the foresight to gather fuel before it was needed, and the social cooperation necessary to maintain flames through the night when everyone wanted to sleep. The immediate benefits were obvious. Benefits were fire provided warmth that allowed humans to survive in climates that would have been impossible to inhabit otherwise. It extended the usable hours of each day, creating time for social activities, tool making, and knowledge sharing that could only happen when people weren't focused solely on finding food or shelter. And perhaps most importantly, fire provided protection from predators whose night vision and natural weapons had given them overwhelming advantages in the darkness. But the deeper transformations were even more significant. Cooking food with fire changed human physiology in ways that are still shaping us today. Raw meat and fibrous plant materials require enormous amounts of energy to digest. The human digestive system has to work incredibly hard to break down tough proteins and extract nutrients from unprocessed plant matter. Cooking does much of this work externally, pre-digesting food through heat and chemical changes that make nutrients far more accessible to the human body. This efficiency gain freed up energy that had previously been devoted to digestion and made it available for other biological processes. Most significantly, it provided the additional calories needed to fuel the growth of larger, more complex brains. The relationship between cooking and brain development is so strong that some scientists argue that without fire control, human intelligence as we know it simply wouldn't exist. The mastery of fire also represents the beginning of chemistry. Our ancestors learned that different materials produced different types of flames, that certain combinations created more heat or less smoke, that specific techniques could produce the exact conditions needed for particular tasks. They discovered that fire could be used not just for cooking and warmth, but for hardening wooden tools, creating new materials through controlled burning, and even as a hunting weapon when used to drive herds of animals in desired directions. The social implications were equally profound. A campfire becomes a natural gathering point, a place where the community comes together to share food, tell stories, and pass on knowledge. The circle of light created by flames defines a space that belongs to humans, a bubble of safety and civilization surrounded by the wild darkness beyond. Within that circle, culture could develop and flourish in ways that would have been impossible for scattered, fearful individuals trying to survive alone. Archaeological sites from around 125,000 years ago show evidence of sophisticated fire management systems. Hearths constructed with carefully arranged stones to control airflow and reflect heat, specialized areas for different types of burning, storage systems for keeping fuel dry and accessible. These weren't random arrangements of burned materials. They were engineered systems designed by people who understood thermal dynamics and had developed precise techniques for managing combustion. The creation of fire itself required innovation and skill that we rarely appreciate today. Without matches or lighters, starting a fire from scratch was a complex process that demanded patience, technique, and the right materials. Some methods involved striking pieces of flint together to create sparks that could ignite carefully prepared tinder. Others used friction techniques, rubbing specific types of wood together under precisely controlled conditions to generate enough heat for ignition. Master firemakers had to understand which materials worked best in different weather conditions, how to prepare tinder that would catch quickly, and how to build up from the smallest spark to a sustainable flame. They had to know how to find dry materials even in wet conditions, how to protect flames from wind and rain, and how to bank fires so they would last through the night without constant attention. This knowledge was so critical that it became embedded in the deepest traditions of human societies. Fire-making techniques were passed down through generations with the same care and precision that we might use to teach life-saving medical procedures. The ability to create fire wasn't just a useful skill, it was the foundation upon which everything else depended. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of fire mastery was how it changed the human relationship with time itself. Before fire, human life was dominated by the rhythms of daylight. Activity was compressed into the hours when natural light made work possible. Rest came with darkness, not by choice but by necessity. Fire extended the human day, creating time that belonged entirely to human purposes. These evening hours became the space where culture could develop, where stories could be told, where complex ideas could be explored and refined. The flickering light of campfires illuminated the first human attempts to understand their place in the cosmos, to create meaning beyond mere survival, and to imagine possibilities that extended far beyond the immediate demands of finding food and shelter. The mastery of fire also marked the beginning of human control over the environment rather than simple adaptation to it. For the first time, humans could carry their preferred conditions with them, creating warmth in cold places, light in dark spaces, and safe zones in dangerous territories. This ability to modify local conditions according to human needs was the first step toward the complete environmental transformation that would eventually lead to agriculture, cities, and the complex technological civilization we inhabit today. Chapter 5: The Needle That Stitched Civilization Together. Around 30,000 years ago, a Stone Age craftsperson made what might seem like a simple observation: that a thin, pointed object with a hole in one end could be used to pull threads through material in precise, controlled ways. This insight led to the creation of the needle, an invention so fundamental that it may have been more important to human survival than the wheel, the lever, or even the written word. Before the needle, clothing was little more than animal hides draped over the body for basic protection. These loose-fitting coverings provided some insulation and weather protection, but they were inefficient, uncomfortable, and inadequate for survival in truly harsh climates. The needle changed everything by making it possible to create fitted, layered clothing systems that could keep humans warm and dry in conditions that would otherwise have been lethal. Archaeological evidence reveals that Stone Age tailors didn't simply sew random pieces of hide together. They were sophisticated clothing designers who understood the thermal properties of different animal skins and how to combine them for maximum effectiveness. Arctic fox fur for the innermost layer, providing lightweight insulation close to the skin. Reindeer hide for middle layers, offering durability and weather resistance. Ptarmigan feathers and other bird materials for specialized applications where weight and flexibility were crucial. These weren't crude garments stitched together by desperate people trying to stay warm. They were carefully engineered systems designed with the same attention to detail that modern mountaineers apply to extreme weather gear. Each layer served a specific purpose. Air gaps between layers provided insulation. Overlapping seams prevented wind penetration. Specialized cuts allowed for freedom of movement while maintaining thermal efficiency. The level of sophistication becomes even more impressive when you consider the tools available. Needles were carved from bone, ivory, or antler using only stone tools. Creating a functional needle required incredible skill and patience. The point had to be sharp enough to penetrate tough hide without splitting it. The eye had to be large enough to accommodate thread, but not so large that it weakened the needle. The entire implement had to be smooth and precisely shaped to avoid catching on fabric or breaking under stress. Thread presented its own challenges. Stone Age sewers used sinew from animal tendons, plant fibers twisted into cordage, or strips of leather cut so thin they could be threaded through needle eyes. Creating strong, flexible thread from these materials required understanding tension, twist ratios, and the specific properties of different organic materials. A poorly made thread would break under stress, potentially ruining hours of careful needlework. The social implications of needle technology were profound. Creating fitted clothing was labor-intensive work that required specialized skills and considerable time investment. This meant that clothing production became a community activity, with different individuals specializing in different aspects of the process. Some became expert hide preparers, understanding how to cure and soften skins for optimal workability. Others mastered the art of cutting patterns that would fit properly when sewn together. Still others developed expertise in the actual sewing process, creating seams that were both strong and weatherproof. This specialization fostered new forms of social cooperation and knowledge sharing. Clothing techniques had to be taught and learned, creating mentorship relationships that went far beyond simple survival skills. The best seamsters became valuable community members whose expertise could mean the difference between life and death during harsh winters. Their knowledge was treasured and carefully preserved, passed down through generations with the same reverence given to hunting skills or tool-making techniques. The needle also made possible the development of portable shelter systems that complemented the permanent structures we discussed earlier. Fitted hides sewn together with waterproof seams could be shaped into tents, lean-tos, or other temporary shelters that could be quickly erected and just as quickly packed away when communities needed to move. These portable shelters weren't crude emergency accommodations. They were sophisticated engineering solutions that provided weatherproof protection while remaining light enough for nomadic groups to carry over long distances. The psychological impact of well-fitted clothing shouldn't be underestimated either. Properly tailored garments didn't just provide superior protection from the elements. They allowed for greater freedom of movement, reduced fatigue from fighting against ill-fitting coverings, and provided a sense of comfort and security that contributed to overall well-being. For people living in constant awareness of their vulnerability to environmental threats, the confidence that came from knowing their clothing would protect them in extreme conditions was invaluable. Archaeological sites from the late Stone Age reveal evidence of clothing so sophisticated that it wouldn't look out of place in a modern outdoor gear catalogue. Multi-layer systems with specialized inner and outer garments, waterproof outer shells made from specially treated hides, insulated boots constructed with multiple materials for warmth, dryness, and durability, gloves and mittens designed for dexterity while maintaining hand warmth, even specialized headgear that provided protection while preserving peripheral vision and hearing. The development of these advanced clothing systems also drove innovation in other areas. Better clothing made it possible for humans to venture into previously uninhabitable regions, expanding the range of environments where human communities could establish themselves. This geographic expansion led to encounters with new resources, new challenges, and new opportunities for cultural and technological development. The needle didn't just change what humans wore, it changed where they could go and how they could live. It was a key that unlocked harsh climates that had previously been off-limits, enabling the human colonization of Northern Europe, Siberia, and eventually the Americas. Without the ability to create effective cold weather clothing, the great human migrations that spread our species across the globe would never have been possible. But perhaps most importantly, the needle represents a perfect example of how Stone Age innovation worked. It wasn't the result of random experimentation or desperate improvisation. It was the product of careful observation, systematic thinking, and patient refinement. Someone looked at the existing technology for joining materials together and envisioned something better. They understood what properties an improved tool would need to have. They developed the techniques necessary to create such a tool, and then they taught others, ensuring that the innovation would spread and be preserved. This pattern of thoughtful innovation, community knowledge sharing, and continuous refinement would repeat itself countless times throughout the Stone Age, driving the development of increasingly sophisticated technologies and social systems. And nowhere was this more evident than in the realm of food preservation and storage, where Stone Age communities developed techniques so effective that some are still used today. Chapter 6: The Alchemy of Preservation. In the quiet moments between hunting and gathering, between shelter construction and tool making, Stone Age communities discovered something that would prove as revolutionary as fire itself: the ability to stop time. Not literally, of course, but in a way that was just as magical to people whose lives were governed by the relentless cycle of abundance and scarcity. They learned how to capture food at its peak and preserve it across seasons, across migrations, across the unpredictable rhythms of survival in a world where tomorrow's meal was never guaranteed. The techniques they developed were elegant in their simplicity, profound in their implications. Two methods emerged as the cornerstones of Stone Age food preservation: dehydration and smoking. Both worked by manipulating the fundamental conditions that bacteria and other microorganisms need to survive and multiply. By removing moisture and altering the chemical environment of food, our ancestors could extend the life of a successful hunt from days to months, transforming a moment of plenty into a buffer against future hunger. Imagine the cognitive leap required to understand these processes. Someone had to observe that meat left in certain conditions, exposed to moving air, positioned near heat sources, treated with smoke from specific types of wood, behaved differently than meat simply left to rot. They had to recognize patterns, test variables, and develop systematic approaches to achieving consistent results. This wasn't accidental discovery, it was methodical experimentation that would have made any modern food scientist proud. The smoking process reveals the sophisticated understanding our ancestors had of chemistry, even if they couldn't articulate it in modern terms. Different woods produced different chemical compounds when burned. Hardwoods like oak and hickory generated formaldehyde and various alcohols that acted as natural preservatives while imparting flavors that actually improved the taste of preserved meat. The smoke itself served multiple functions. It dried the surface of the meat, created chemical barriers against bacterial growth, and formed protective layers that sealed in nutrients while keeping contaminants out. Creating properly smoked meat required precise control of temperature, airflow, and timing. Too much heat would cook the meat before it could dry properly. Too little would allow spoilage to begin before preservation was complete. The ideal texture for long-term storage was similar to what we now call jerky, dry enough to resist bacterial growth, but not so desiccated that it became inedible. Achieving this balance required knowledge that was accumulated over generations, refined through trial and error, and passed down with the same careful attention given to hunting techniques or tool-making skills. Dehydration presented its own technical challenges. In regions with reliable sunshine, meat and plant materials could be laid out on specially constructed drying racks, positioned to maximize air circulation, while protecting food from insects and scavengers. But effective dehydration required understanding subtle environmental factors, humidity levels that could make or break a preservation attempt, wind patterns that could speed or slow the drying process, and seasonal variations that affected how quickly moisture could be extracted from different types of food. Stone Age communities developed a sophisticated infrastructure to support these preservation activities. Archaeological sites reveal evidence of specialized drying areas with carefully constructed windbreaks, elevated platforms that kept food away from ground moisture, and storage facilities designed to protect preserved foods from rain, snow, and animal intrusion. These weren't temporary expedients thrown together in moments of crisis. They were permanent installations that required community planning, resource allocation, and ongoing maintenance. The social organisation around food preservation was equally complex. Successful smoking and drying required constant attention over periods of days or weeks. Someone had to monitor temperatures, adjust ventilation, rotate materials for even treatment, and guard against the many things that could go wrong. This meant that preservation activities became community projects that required coordination, task sharing, and collective decision-making about resource allocation. The knowledge required for effective preservation was encyclopedic in scope. Successful practitioners had to understand the properties of different animal parts, which cuts dried best, which required special treatment, which were suitable for different preservation methods. They needed to know about plant materials, understanding which fruits and vegetables could be dried successfully, which required special preparation, and which combinations provided the most nutritional value during long storage periods. Timing was crucial in ways that required deep understanding of natural cycles. The best times for preservation activities varied by season, weather conditions, and the specific materials being processed. A sudden change in humidity could ruin days of work. An unexpected rain could destroy an entire batch of drying meat. Successful preservation required the ability to read environmental conditions with the precision of a modern meteorologist. Making decisions about when to start processes based on subtle cues that indicated favourable conditions were likely to persist. The nutritional implications of these preservation techniques were profound. Properly preserved foods didn't just last longer, they often became more nutritious in certain ways. The concentration that resulted from moisture removal meant that preserved foods packed more calories and nutrients per unit of weight, making them ideal for situations where portability was important. Smoking added beneficial compounds, while the careful selection of preservation materials could supplement the diet with trace nutrients that might otherwise be scarce. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Stone Age food preservation was how it changed the relationship between communities and their environment. For the first time in human history, abundance in one season could be systematically converted into security for future seasons. A successful hunt during peak migration periods could be transformed into protein reserves that would last through harsh winters. A good harvest of berries or nuts could be preserved to provide essential nutrients during times when fresh plant foods were unavailable. This ability to smooth out the feast or famine cycles that had governed survival created new possibilities for social development. Communities that had mastered preservation techniques could support larger populations, invest time in activities beyond immediate survival needs, and develop the social complexity that would eventually lead to more advanced forms of civilization. Preserved food was, in many ways, the first form of wealth, storable value that could be accumulated, traded, and used to support specialized activities that contributed to community welfare. The trading implications were equally significant. Preserved foods could be transported over long distances without spoiling, making them ideal for exchange between communities. Different regions specialized in preserving different types of food based on local resources and environmental conditions. Coastal communities might focus on preserving fish and marine resources, while inland groups specialized in preserving game meat or plant materials. This specialization created trade networks that connected distant communities and facilitated the exchange of knowledge, techniques, and genetic diversity that strengthened the overall human population. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Stone Age preservation techniques were so effective that they remained virtually unchanged for thousands of years. The methods used by Scandinavian communities to smoke fish, for example, bear striking similarities to techniques still used in the same regions today. This continuity speaks to the fundamental soundness of the approaches our ancestors developed and the care with which this knowledge was preserved and transmitted across generations. The development of preservation techniques also drove innovation in container technology. Preserved foods needed to be stored in ways that protected them from moisture, pests, and contamination, while remaining accessible when needed. This led to the development of sophisticated storage vessels made from animal skins, plant materials, and eventually pottery. These containers weren't just functional. They were often decorated with intricate designs that may have served as identification systems, indicating what type of food was stored inside or which family or individual had prepared it. The psychological impact of successful food preservation shouldn't be underestimated. For people living in constant awareness of their vulnerability to starvation, the sight of well-stocked storage areas provided a sense of security that went far beyond simple calorie counting. Preserved food represented mastery over uncertainty, evidence that human intelligence and planning could triumph over the arbitrary cruelties of nature. This confidence freed mental energy for other pursuits, and may have been crucial in fostering the kind of long-term thinking that eventually led to agriculture and permanent settlement. Chapter 7. The Web of Cooperation. As remarkable as these individual innovations were, the tools, the shelters, the fire mastery, the preservation techniques, none of them would have been sufficient to ensure human survival in the harsh world of the Stone Age if they had existed in isolation. The true secret of Stone Age success lay not in any single technology or technique, but in something far more sophisticated: the development of social systems that could support, preserve, and continuously improve upon these innovations across generations. The social organization of Stone Age communities reveals levels of cooperation and coordination that challenge many of our assumptions about prehistoric life. These weren't random collections of individuals struggling separately for survival. They were highly organized societies with complex systems for decision-making, resource allocation, knowledge preservation, and conflict resolution. Understanding how these societies functioned gives us insight not just into how our ancestors survived, but into the fundamental social innovations that made human civilization possible. The basic unit of Stone Age society was the band, a group typically numbering between 20 and 40 individuals, usually related by blood or marriage ties. But these bands weren't isolated entities. Archaeological evidence reveals extensive networks of interaction between groups, with regular gatherings that served multiple functions: mate exchange that prevented inbreeding, information sharing that spread technological innovations, cooperative hunting of large game that required more people than any single band could provide, and conflict resolution that prevented minor disputes from escalating into destructive warfare. The decision-making processes within these bands were remarkably sophisticated. Rather than relying on permanent hierarchies or authoritarian leadership, many Stone Age societies appear to have operated on principles of consensus and collective wisdom. Important decisions: where to migrate, when to begin major hunts, how to allocate scarce resources, were made through extended discussions that ensured all perspectives were heard and considered. This approach wasn't just more democratic than hierarchical systems, it was often more effective, drawing on the diverse experiences and knowledge of all community members to reach better solutions. The egalitarian nature of many Stone Age societies wasn't simply a matter of ideology, it was a survival strategy. In small groups where everyone's contributions were essential, maintaining social cohesion was literally a matter of life and death. Systems that allowed individuals to accumulate excessive power or resources at the expense of others would have weakened the group's overall survival prospects. Cooperation wasn't just morally preferable, it was evolutionarily advantageous. Knowledge preservation in these societies was a community responsibility that required sophisticated social mechanisms. Without writing systems, all of the accumulated wisdom about tool-making, hunting techniques, food preservation, shelter construction, and countless other survival skills had to be stored in human memory and transmitted through direct teaching. This created intense pressure to develop effective educational systems that could ensure critical knowledge wasn't lost when individuals died or communities split apart. The solution was elegant: embed survival knowledge in stories, songs, rituals, and artistic traditions that were engaging enough to be remembered and meaningful enough to be faithfully transmitted. The elaborate cave paintings we find at sites across Europe and Africa weren't just artistic expressions, they were educational materials, mnemonic devices that helped preserve detailed knowledge about animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and hunting strategies. The ceremonies and rituals that anthropologists observe in modern hunter-gatherer societies serve similar functions, encoding practical survival information in memorable, culturally significant forms. This integration of practical knowledge with cultural expression created powerful synergies. Stories about successful hunts didn't just preserve technical information about weapons and tactics. They also reinforced social values about cooperation, courage, and resource sharing. Rituals around food preparation didn't just teach preservation techniques, they also strengthened community bonds and ensured that knowledge was shared rather than hoarded. Art wasn't separate from survival. It was one of the primary mechanisms through which survival knowledge was preserved and transmitted. The specialization that developed within Stone Age communities was another crucial factor in their success. While everyone needed to know basic survival skills, different individuals became experts in different areas. Master toolmakers who understood the properties of different stones and the precise techniques needed to create specific implements. Expert hunters who had developed extraordinary skills in tracking and weapon use. Skilled healers who understood which plants could treat injuries and illnesses. And talented storytellers who served as living libraries of community knowledge. This specialization created interdependencies that strengthened community bonds. No individual could master all of the skills needed for survival, which meant everyone depended on others for their expertise. The toolmaker needed the hunter to provide materials and the healer to treat injuries sustained during dangerous work. The hunter needed tools from the specialist and knowledge from the storyteller about animal behavior and seasonal patterns. These interdependencies created incentives for cooperation and mutual support that went far beyond simple reciprocity. The care that Stone Age communities showed for their most vulnerable members reveals another crucial aspect of their social organization. Archaeological evidence indicates that individuals with disabilities, chronic illnesses, or age-related limitations were often supported by their communities for years or even decades. This wasn't just compassion, though it certainly reflected advanced moral development. It was also practical. Older community members possessed irreplaceable knowledge and experience. Individuals who couldn't participate in physically demanding activities often became specialists in other areas that contributed to community welfare. Conflict resolution mechanisms were equally sophisticated. In small communities where everyone had to work together for survival, disputes that weren't resolved quickly could become existential threats to the entire group. Stone Age societies developed elaborate systems for mediating conflicts, often involving ritualized processes that allowed grievances to be aired publicly, community input to be gathered, and solutions to be implemented that restored social harmony while addressing legitimate concerns. The seasonal gatherings that brought multiple bands together served crucial functions in maintaining genetic diversity and cultural exchange. These weren't just social occasions, they were opportunities for young people to find mates from other groups, for specialists to share techniques and innovations, for communities to coordinate responses to environmental challenges that affected multiple groups, and for conflicts between bands to be resolved before they escalated into violence. The knowledge sharing that occurred at these gatherings was systematic and comprehensive. Master craftspeople would demonstrate techniques to apprentices from other communities. Successful hunters would share information about animal movements and new weapons. Healers would exchange knowledge about medicinal plants and treatment methods. These gatherings functioned like primitive universities, centers of learning where the accumulated knowledge of multiple communities could be combined, compared, and improved upon. The trading that occurred at these gatherings reveals another dimension of Stone Age social complexity. Different regions specialized in different resources based on local geology, climate, and ecosystem characteristics. Coastal communities had access to marine resources and materials like shells that were valuable for tools and decoration. Mountain communities had access to specific types of stone that were ideal for particular tools. Forest communities had access to woods, plant materials, and animal resources that weren't available elsewhere. The exchange networks that developed to distribute these specialized resources across vast geographic areas required sophisticated systems of value assessment, trade protocol, and trust maintenance. Archaeological evidence reveals trade goods that traveled hundreds or even thousands of miles from their sources, indicating exchange networks that connected communities across entire continents. These networks weren't just economic systems, they were information highways that spread technological innovations, cultural practices, and genetic diversity across the entire human population. The environmental knowledge that Stone Age communities accumulated was encyclopedic in scope and precise in detail. Successful survival required understanding seasonal patterns, weather prediction, plant and animal behavior, geological processes, and countless other aspects of the natural world. This knowledge had to be accurate, mistakes could be fatal, and comprehensive enough to handle the wide range of situations that mobile hunter-gatherer communities might encounter. But perhaps most importantly, Stone Age social systems had to be adaptive. Environmental conditions changed constantly, sometimes gradually over seasons or years, sometimes suddenly due to climate shifts, natural disasters, or resource depletion. Communities that couldn't adjust their social organization, resource allocation, and survival strategies to meet new challenges didn't survive. The societies that succeeded were those that maintained enough flexibility to innovate while preserving enough stability to function effectively. This balance between innovation and tradition required sophisticated cultural mechanisms. New ideas had to be tested carefully before being adopted widely. Premature adoption of untested innovations could be disastrous. But resistance to change could be equally dangerous if it prevented communities from adapting to new conditions. Successful Stone Age societies developed cultural processes that encouraged experimentation while maintaining proven practices, that valued innovation while respecting traditional knowledge, and that could implement changes rapidly when circumstances demanded it. The social innovations of the Stone Age were every bit as important as the technological ones. The systems of cooperation, knowledge preservation, specialization, and adaptation that our ancestors developed created the foundation upon which all subsequent human achievements would be built. Understanding these social systems helps us appreciate that Stone Age success wasn't just about individual ingenuity or technological advancement. It was about creating communities that were greater than the sum of their parts, societies that could amplify individual capabilities through collective action and preserve achievements across generations through cultural transmission. But even these remarkable social systems wouldn't have been enough to ensure human survival if our ancestors hadn't also undergone profound biological changes that made them uniquely suited for the challenges they faced. The story of Stone Age survival is also the story of human evolution, of bodies and brains adapting to the demands of a lifestyle that required unprecedented levels of intelligence, cooperation, and endurance. Chapter 8: The Architecture of the Human Machine. The human body that carried our ancestors through the trials of the Stone Age wasn't the same body that had first descended from the trees millions of years earlier. Evolution had been working its quiet magic, reshaping bone and muscle, rewiring neural pathways, and fine-tuning biological systems in response to the extraordinary demands of Stone Age life. The result was something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth. A creature whose body was as much a product of its own innovations as it was of natural selection. Consider the human hand for a moment. Look at your own fingers as you listen to this. Those same digits that now tap on keyboards and scroll through smartphones were once the most sophisticated tools in existence. The opposable thumb, the precise grip strength, the sensitivity of fingertips capable of detecting textures and pressures measured in fractions of ounces. All of these features were refined through millions of years of tool use and manufacturing. But the remarkable adaptations went far deeper than manual dexterity. The human brain underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. Between 2 and 3 million years ago, our ancestors' brains began growing at an unprecedented rate, eventually reaching sizes that would have seemed impossible for creatures of our body weight. This growth wasn't random, it was driven by the specific cognitive demands of Stone Age life. Problem-solving became a survival skill that required entirely new forms of mental processing. Creating an effective stone tool demanded spatial reasoning, sequential planning, and the ability to visualize end results before beginning work. Successful hunting required pattern recognition, predictive thinking, and the capacity to coordinate complex group activities. Food preservation needed understanding of cause and effect relationships, timing, and environmental variables that changed seasonally. And so, as we reach the end of this journey through time, we discover that the shocking truth about Stone Age survival isn't just a story about the past, it's a blueprint written in our very DNA. Every time you solve a complex problem, every time you work together with others toward a common goal, every time you adapt to unexpected change, you're channeling the same remarkable capabilities that carried our ancestors through millions of years of challenges that would humble us today. The real revelation isn't that they survived, but how completely they mastered survival through innovation, cooperation, and an unshakable commitment to preserving knowledge across generations. They didn't just endure, they laid the foundation for everything we would become. And perhaps most remarkably, they did it all with nothing but stone, fire, and the extraordinary power of human ingenuity working in harmony with the natural world. If you found yourself drawn into this exploration of our deepest past, you might be curious about another chapter in human survival that's equally fascinating. Because long after the Stone Age ended, our ancestors faced perhaps their greatest test of all, a world locked in ice where entire continents disappeared beneath glaciers, and survival meant adapting to conditions so extreme they would reshape the very face of the Earth. That story awaits in What Was Earth Like During the Ice Age? The Shocking Truth. During the Ice Age, the Shocking Truth.